conference room since we are still at the meeting participants. So we will wait for around 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you very much for your patience. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's CCS webinar. Today is our great honor to have Professor Dr Hongwei from Nottingham University in the UK. So today's talk is about contemporary Chinese queer cinema. As you can see from the if any people have questions or problems to access the PowerPoint or about the voice system, please feel free to let me know. So it's our great honor to have Professor Bao again. So I will have a brief introduction. Professor Bao Hongwei is Associate Professor in Media Studies at the University of Nottingham, the United Kingdom. He is also the director of the Center for Contemporary East Asian Cultural Studies. He is the author of 3 research monographs on queer Chinese culture, respectively titled Queer Comrade, Queer China, and Queer Media in China. He serves on the editorial board of British Journal of Chinese Studies and Chinese Independent Cinema Observer, as well as the International Advisory Boards of Queer Asian Book Series, which is published under the Hong Kong University Press. He is also in the editorial board of Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art and the 热风学术. He also writes and edits a column titled Queer Links for the Chinese Independent Film Archives. Today, he is going to give a talk on the brief history of queer representation of contemporary mainland Chinese screen since the 1990s, highlighting some of the key titles, directors, and styles. So welcome to join us today. First of all, may I invite you to present a big thank you and big clap to Professor Bao virtually or physically. So welcome, Professor Bao. So now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for your very kind introduction, and thank CCS and Gender Studies program at CUHK for inviting me to share with you. So this is probably not a formal academic talk that you would expect. It's more of a kind of a review of my personal favorites. So I'm going to select some titles to talk about and show some film clips. But this is not a full history of Chinese queer cinema. So let me actually just start by first explaining that you're going to hear some background noise as I talk. This is because my neighbor is doing some building work. And as you can imagine, there's little you can do with your neighbor. So basically, so just put up with the background noise in case you hear some, and hopefully you'll still be able to hear me clearly and see the screen clearly. And of course, for an academic talk, you usually have to define what is Chinese, what is queer, and what is cinema. So here, I would just want to say that for the purpose of this talk, I'm defining actually Chinese cinema as the cinema or queer films from the PRC, from mainland China. So in a way, actually, I'm excluding some titles from Hong Kong and other Sinophone spheres. This is really for strategic reasons. So in a way, actually, those films from Sinophone spheres have already been extensively studied by scholars such as Song Huilin and Shi Yanchao. Actually both have connections with CUHK, and Song Huilin is currently working at CUHK. So CUHK is really, in a way, a hub for Chinese queer studies. So my research primarily focuses on queer films, especially queer screen activism from mainland China. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So it's not a comprehensive survey of queer Chinese film history, but a selection of some of the works that I consider to be important and that I like, that I personally recommend. Of course, while we're talking, a film festival is going on in Beijing at the moment, which is Beijing Queer Film Festival. So this year is the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Queer Film Festival. So I remember that in 2001, while I was studying at Peking University, so the first edition of the festival took place. Although I didn't have the opportunity to go to the festival, so I knew about the festival, and I didn't expect that the festival actually would be so long lasting and would have such a big impact on my life. It looks like in the past 20 years, I've been studying or working with queer cinemas and queer filmmakers from mainland China most of the time. So in a way, actually, this festival, Queer Film Festival, has a very special place in my heart. But of course, when I say it's 20 years anniversary, so of course this 20 years has not been easy, and there has been turbulences, frequent shutdowns, and forced change of location, and so on, which simply demonstrate how difficult it is still to make queer films in mainland China today and to conduct any kind of queer activism. So without giving out much information about this year's Beijing Queer Film Festival, let's just celebrate. So the mere fact that the festival continues showcases the tenacity of queer filmmakers and queer cinema from mainland China. So in a way, my big respect for all the film festival organizers and filmmakers. So after the festival, you'll probably hear more publicity, but at the moment, let's just stop at that. So screening, identities, and desires. So film festivals are important because they encourage queer people to express themselves and to represent themselves instead of being represented passively by other people. There is a question of subject position. Of course, we can't say that films made by gays and lesbians are definitely different from films made by heterosexually and cisgender identified people. But sometimes there is a difference in terms of the subject positions of the filmmakers, which might have an impact on the representation themselves. So today I'm going to argue that all those films are not simply representations, they have an impact on people's lived experiences. They have an impact on identities, communities, and social change. And those films have, in a way, contributed to a better understanding of diverse gender and sexualities in mainland China. So they are, in a way, playing a positive role in representation. Okay, so my talk is divided into 4 parts. So part 1, I'll talk about celluloid comrades, which is kind of implicit representation of queerness in the 1980s and 90s. And then I'll talk about digital video activism, which is from the 2000s to now, to showcase how queer films are used as acts of activism or parts of activism for queer identities, communities, and desires. I'll also mention a few recent queer feature films or queer fiction films, and I'll finish today's talk with an introduction of some trans films or some films of transgender representations. So I will have some film clips to play, but I'll try actually not to play too many because they take a lot of time. So talking about queer cinema, of course, if you look at the kind of Chinese film history from the earlier 20th century, you'll probably see homoerotic desires everywhere, and including sometimes in unexpected places. For example, in the 1980s and 90s, there were some films, either they are melodrama made by Xie Jin, for example, the Stage 2 Sisters, or they are what we call men melody films. For example, Chen Kaige's Da Yuebing, the Big Day Parade. So in a way, they showcase a kind of homoeroticism between men or between women, but none of these have explicitly labeled those characters as queer characters. And indeed, it is sometimes not doing justice to history to label those films as queer films. It really depends on how we explain queerness. Do we define queerness as a kind of sensibility, as people's intimacy relationship, or as a kind of gay identity? So that's those what I call celluloid closets or celluloid comrades. In fact, these two words come from other scholars. So celluloid closet comes from Vito Russo's famous book, which traces the homoeroticism, for example, in the kind of Hollywood golden era production. And celluloid comrades is the title of a book by Song Huilin from 2006. So Professor Song basically analyzes queer representations in the Chinese speaking or Chinese language world. And most of them focus on the kind of implicit or subtle representation of queerness, which may or may not translate into a sexual identity. So that's the era when you can read a film text queerly. Queer people can probably identify spots of homoeroticism, but they are not clearly identified as such. And in fact, probably a lot of filmmakers are not aware of the homoeroticism in those texts. So what I call queer subtext. So there are a lot of these films, and I'm not going to list titles, but here are the two titles. And in Zhao Xiyan's recent book, what's it called? Queer Representations in Chinese Language Film and the Cultural Landscape, there's a fantastic chapter analyzing Stage 2 Sisters, which is really well worth reading, which in a way paved our understanding of some of those implicit representations on screen. Okay, so probably a lot of people would probably agree with me that the first often cited queer films, or the first film that can be explicitly read as queer, is Farewell, My Concubine. But when I say explicitly, I'm probably hesitating because it's actually very implicit, and you really need a pair of queer eyes in order to detect the kind of homoeroticism between these two people. And it seems that the kind of opera stage becomes a good place for homoeroticism to be acted out. This is because of the long history of homoeroticism in Chinese opera stage, whether it's Peking opera or 越剧 or Cantonese opera and so on. So there is a very strong history of cross-dressing performance. There's also a history of homoeroticism. However, that kind of history was pretty much, in a way, erased and forgotten during the socialist era. And it is only in the post-Mao era that people started to look at that history, to unearth that history. So that is, in a way, the origin of Farewell My Concubine, which is supposed to be a history of the Chinese opera, the history of a particular type of practice, which is cross-dressing performance on Chinese opera stage. But of course, this story involves the intimacy between two actors. So most people would be familiar with Farewell My Concubine, but I'm still going to play this video clip to give you a sense of how homoeroticism is enacted on stage and in cinema.
古年方二八，正青春，北师傅修去了头发。我本是女娇罗，又不是男儿郎。
I'll stop here by saying that this is considered to be a queer film, but at the same time, it is also an important transgender film. So after all, this is cross-dressing, and after all, this is kind of transgender embodiment. So a history about trans representation in Chinese cinema needs to be written, and this film certainly takes a very important place in trans representation or in understanding what is transness in the Chinese speaking sphere. So of course, you'll notice one coincidence, which is most of the earlier queer representations from mainland China have very strong trans element. So in a way, those queer films are also trans films in that the characters, the gay characters or the queer characters, in a way actually have got cross-dressing elements, or they behave effeminately. And this is because of many reasons. Of course, there was that historical, medical, and psychiatric understanding of homosexual as gender inversion. So that was kind of the medical science explaining homosexuality at that time. But also there was the kind of gender fluidity and gender expressions in, for example, Chinese opera stage or traditional Chinese theater, which in a way actually paved the way for our contemporary understanding and even discovery of the queer heritage on Chinese screen. So the next film title I'm going to mention is probably the first explicitly gay identified film. When I say explicitly gay identified, this is because in the film, the main character, Alan, the protagonist, declares, yes, I'm a homosexual. I love you. So you can say that I'm despicable, but you cannot say that my love for you is despicable. So in a way, actually, this is a very bold statement in the 1990s about gay love. So Zhang Yuan at that time worked with Wang Xiaobo and Li Yinghe. For many people who are familiar with queer studies, so Li Yinghe was in a way the first sociologist in post-Mao China to study homosexuality openly. So in a way, they visited many gay people cruising areas such as Dongdan Gongyuan, Dongdan Park in Beijing, and they witnessed the kind of police arrest and harassment of gay people. So with very strong sense of empathy, Zhang Yuan made this independent film. So for him, actually, the kind of Alan, the gay character, became the embodiment of China, marginalized people in China, including artists, filmmakers who are outside of China's mainstream literary and film establishment. So East Palace and West Palace is a very unforgettable film. Today, when we see the film, on the one hand, we were struck by the kind of realism, the portrayal of the police brutality towards gay people. And on the other hand, there is also a kind of very lyrical moment when in Alan's narration, suddenly there's a flashback, and then there's a stream consciousness of Alan thinking about the past and transforming into an ancient character on stage. So I couldn't find a good trailer, but on YouTube, you can find the whole film. So I'm going to skip the film clip here. Oops, so, okay, so it's still played anyway. So this was the beginning scene when there was a kind of roundup of cruising gay men in the park based on the kind of well-known Dongdan Park harassment at the time in the 1980s and 90s. Okay, so I'll stop here. So in a way, I mean, there's very strong sense of realism in this part. But in later sequences, there are very interesting mediation of opera performance. Okay, so far we've talked about Chinese gay films or gay identified films. At the same time, there are also lesbian films. So the first lesbian documentary or documentary about lesbian lives is Ying Weiwei's Hezi, the box, produced around the 2000s. But of course, not many people had the opportunity to see that underground film, which had very limited circulation. But on YouTube and on many public venues, you can probably still see this film called Fish and Elephant, 今年夏天. So made by Li Yu, a feminist filmmaker, woman filmmaker with a very strong feminist stance. And the film was made in 2001, featuring Pan Yi and Shi Tou. We're going to talk about Shi Tou, one of the lead characters, in a moment, who later became a filmmaker herself. So in 2001, it seemed there are many historical changes, including the removal of homosexuality or the partial removal of homosexuality from China's mental disorder classification, and the first Beijing Queer Film Festival mentioned at the beginning of today's talk. And Fish and Elephant is a very quiet and it's also a very sentimental film showcasing the intimacy between two women. So the English title is Fish and Elephant, referring to those imageries of animals. Okay, so it is a beautiful film. I wish that this film could be restored. And in recent years, there is a kind of wave of restoring old films into 4K format. And many of these good old films, including East Palace, West Palace, and Fish and Elephant, are still, classics when we watch them today. So there is one film that has recently been restored, which is Lan Yu. And in fact, at Nottingham, so the film Lan Yu, a new version of the film Lan Yu was screened last week. So with a producer at present. And also, I think it's tomorrow at Hawaii International Film Festival, the kind of 4K restoration version of Lan Yu is going to be shown as well. And Stanley Kwan will attend the film festival. And in a way, actually, the film has special meanings for me, because when I was studying 20 years ago at university, and that film became a kind of critical moment for me to, in a way, to reconcile with my own queer identities and sexualities, etc. So after I talked to many people, I realized Lan Yu is an important text for many gays and lesbians who lived through that era, because in this film, actually, a gay person wasn't portrayed in a negative way or in a kind of effeminate way. Also, we're not undermining the importance of previous representations, but this film actually explicitly portrays the main characters as kind of masculine, as in a way normal. Of course, there is a risk of homonormativity in here, but this film essentially is about a love story. And of course, this is a rhetoric with many people. So this is a love story. It happens that the two characters happen to be men and so on. This can become an excuse for marginalizing queer characters. But Lan Yu actually really portrays queer love in a kind of really positive way. And I want to highlight another aspect, which is a political aspect of the film. So in the story, the Beijing story, where the novel is adapted from, there is a sequence of the Tiananmen. So after that incident, so both characters, Lan Yu and Han Dong, reconciled with their queer identities and desires. So that part was, in a way, actually played down in the film, but still, actually, you can sense, or you can probably get a glimpse of that historical moment. So in a way, actually, queer identities become a symptom of that historical trauma. So that's Lan Yu. So the sound is very low, in case you're wondering. Okay, so anyway, so that was a very long night, and it was a rare moment that Chinese queer cinema actually articulates its political stance. So in a way, actually, East Palace and West Palace already discussed the relationship between the state and the citizens and individuals. And this is another instance that queer cinema actually demonstrates the kind of political potential of queerness. Okay, so in a way, the political potential of queerness and radical potential of queerness is continuing, well, since homosexuality, in a way, became decriminalized and depathologized. So into 2000s, a lot of gays and lesbians pick up the camera actually themselves and portray their lives. So in a way, they're not happy with a mainstream representation of queerness, which is really lacking, or which shows a stereotypical image of gays and lesbians. So I mentioned Beijing Queer Film Festival and recently Shanghai Queer Film Festival, CinemaQ, and many other queer film screenings. Although these events, public events, are becoming more and more difficult, but a lot of them are still continuing. Okay, so into 2000s, a queer filmmaker made many films. He used to be a writer and playwright and literary theorist, and he wrote beautifully, but when he picked up the camera, he decided to do away with all the cinematic traditions, with all the cinematic techniques, and he really uses film as a type of activism. So if we think about the kind of deconstruction of Andy Warhol, then we would consider equally actually relate Cui Zien's wolf as a type of destroying or deconstructing the social norms. Here, social norms is not only understood as a kind of cinematic conventions in cinematic techniques, but also in gender sexual norms. So here, transgender is seen as a quintessential queerness because nobody has to be restricted by their conventional gender roles. And this is a clip from Enter the Clowns, one of the earlier films by Cui Zian.
照片都换成女装的了。
不是女装的，是人的照片。
看我，你总不能让我去喜欢一个女人吧？
那你可以去喜欢你的男人。我现在就是这样的，不好吗？
你能不能像以前一样？
做你娘的梦去吧！以前那样，我不喜欢以前那样，我喜欢我现在这样。
Okay, so get a sense of Cui Zien's films, and a lot of his films are seen as art house or experimental films made on a very low budget, but at the same time, they transgress or subverse gender, sexual, and social norms, as well as cinematic conventions. And Cui sees his filmmaking as an act of activism with digital videos. So Cui was one of the first queer film directors who embraced the potential of digital films. And he calls his activism as digital video activism or 影像行动. So as in today's title of the talk. So of course, apart from those feature films, which are mostly very abstruse and very long and slow, and Cui Zien has also made some documentaries, including this Queer China, Comrade China, 志同志. So Queer China, Comrade China is probably the first documentary that documents China's LGBTQ history. So the film was made in 2008 and 7 or 8 and so on. So it documents a queer activism from the 1990s to early 2000s. But of course, there are many things that he didn't anticipate. So there are other documentaries which trace the queer activist history to a longer historical period. For example, We Are Here, so made by Xu Tou, which is about lesbian activism from the 1990s to 2000s. And then there's Shanghai Queer, made by Xiang Qi, so which is about Shanghai's queer activism from the 1990s to 2010s and so on. So what's interesting about Queer China, Comrade China is that it's not only a history of queer activism, it's also in a way an essay of what is Chinese queerness, what is Chinese queer activism, what can Chinese queer culture and activism be? For example, so the director interviews some activists who talk about some kind of localized queer activist strategies.
这个最开始的概念还是对吧？教育在西方的一些活动，就比如电影节，就比如游行，这很难在大陆实现，所以我们只能通过一些别的方式。英兰提出，我们也许可以在中国试着组织大家在教育去放彩虹风筝，而且是要选择一个是跟中国的一个文化特色相关的，就让人看。 就能感觉啊，这是中国的同志们在庆祝骄傲。第一年我们在北京就开展的很顺利嘛，于是，在后来的几年中，就是号召呢是大陆的可能就是各个活动、各个城市的同志小组都可以组织这样的活动，希望选择在一个当地就是有文化特色的。
Okay, so that's a film clip from Cui Zi'en's Queer China, Comrade China. Okay, and of course, with the spread of digital video cameras, so more and more young people, younger generation picked up the video camera and made documentaries. So there are many reasons as to why documentaries become a dominant form actually for queer activism. But because of its kind of realistic depiction, because of its direct engagement with the social, and because it's easier to make, it requires a lower budget than a kind of fiction film. So in a way, actually, those documentary films, it becomes good documentation of China's community history. And speaking of which, Fan Popo played a very important role in documenting China's queer community history. And some of his films, including Papa Rainbow, Mama Rainbow, and Chinese Closet, really dramatizes one of the most important tensions or themes in Chinese queer culture, which is the parent-children relationship. So of course, a lot of his films were supported by P-Flag China. Still, a fan tries to demonstrate the complexity of such negotiation and of whether coming out would be a good strategy for Chinese queer culture. So here, let's play a short video clip from Papa Rainbow, which is the third film in Fan Popo's queer family trilogy.
他在行为上，在生活习惯上不太一样。就是我所受的教育当中，这还是可以属于心理变态。男朋友是啊，我喜欢玩海啊。你说说，你不是带着媳妇儿回来吗？你给我滚！再给我滚！
Okay, so I'll stop here just to say that this is an interesting film because the film actually also is combined with theatrical performance. So in order to make the dads comfortable in talking about their emotions and feelings and so on, so Fan and others really enacted or kind of rehearsed a theater. So asking those dads and sons and daughters and so on to play a character. So this kind of filming technique is very interesting. So in a way, it really, blurs the boundary between what is documentary and what is performance. And perhaps this is what can be called a performative documentary. Within this kind of enactment or reenactment of the scene, a theme is explored. So this also draws on the kind of theater of the oppressed tradition. So after the theater performance, the audience are encouraged to talk about what their ideal solution or what their ideal scenario would be. And then this play was reenacted again. So to showcase different possibilities of life. Okay, so Fan also made some films, including the China Monologue, which is a Chinese translation and enactment of the Vagina monologues, as well as Be a Woman, which is a transgender film, which... Okay, so this is a documentary documenting 3 performances, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Beijing, I think. So 3 performances of vagina monologues. So it also raises questions about the transnational travel of feminist theory and practices. To what extent is vagina monologues Chinese or applied to the Chinese context? So of course, we have been mostly talking about male identified queer filmmakers. Of course, there are also lesbian filmmakers, and they also made some fantastic films. For example, He Xiaopei. He Xiaopei has made some documentaries which mostly focus on the kind of queer feelings and experiences in the communities. For example, Our Marriages. So instead of condemning the same, what is called 形式婚姻, proforma marriage or cooperative marriages, so He Xiaopei really follows the life of 2 lesbian couples and showcases actually how this kind of queer form of marriage can also be a liberating thing for individuals. They can subvert the traditional norms of heteronormativity and even homonormativity. So to think queerly is, in a way, He Xiaopei's endeavor, as is also the case in her other documentary, documenting her own life and feelings. That's Polyamorous Family.
I have 2 girlfriends. They also have their own partners apart from me. Many people ask me about my relationship. For them, polyamory seems unbelievable, like these flying starlings. So I made this film. My name is Xiaopei. This is my girlfriend Jaya and my girlfriend Sue, Sue's boyfriend Owen. I was born in Beijing. I grew up and live in Beijing.
Okay, so although many filmmakers have adopted a first-person narrative and a kind of ethnographic way of narration of telling stories, still He Xiaopei puts herself explicitly in the storyline and showcases her subjectivity as queer female filmmaker. So let's move on to the next filmmaker, who's Shito. Remember earlier we talked about the first lesbian fiction film, 今年夏天 Fish and Elephant. So at that time, Shito participated in the film as an actress. But by that time, she was already a famous queer artist. She has made some paintings, photography, installation, which showcases a kind of same-sex intimacy between women. And in particular, she foregrounds herself and her partner Ming Ming in those artworks. And a lot of her films actually feature female intimacy in China. For example, there's a film called Women 50 Minutes, which basically documents the different types of female intimacy and female lives in China. So that is a 50-minute film. And in a way, it's an essay film talking about what's the condition of female same-sex intimacy in China at that time. So what I'm going to showcase here is a short documentary about Valentine's Day. So I think that in 2010s, a lot of queer activism centers on Valentine's Day, because on Valentine's Day, in a way, it's legitimate to talk about queer relationship and gay weddings. So activists, basically walk up to the street and interview pedestrians about their attitudes towards same-sex marriage. They either distribute flowers or have same-sex wedding photos, or even walk into the civil registration office or marriage registry to register for their marriage. So this kind of activism were documented in the documentary film. And of course, the act of doing those things also become a part of socially engaged artwork. Okay, I'll finish this. Okay, so of course, this scene was shot in Beijing in about 2007. I wonder what people's responses would be today. Okay, so there are also other queer filmmakers and queer film organizers, festival organizers, including Yang Yang, who participated in Queer Film Festival from 2001. And she made a story about the Queer Film Festival called our story, Beijing 10 years of guerrilla warfare. So of course, this year is the 20 years of Beijing Queer Film Festival. Is that still guerrilla warfare? And what can they survive in Beijing? So these are all open questions. And Wei Tingting, probably most people are familiar with her feminist activism, but probably not many of you know that she has made some documentaries. She has made some queer films, including one film talking about her bisexual identity. So again, the first person narrative and the director's subjectivity is strongly foregrounded in the film.
有点版面不好，这个机器，天！哇，这次 OK 了，已经是在录了。
And the film was a product of Queer Comrades, Queer University video workshop, which trains ordinary queer people to pick up cameras and to make their own lives. So indeed, Queer University, and Queer Comrades are important in a way endeavors or projects in mainland China. So Queer Comrades is a webcast website. So they used to release regularly, actually publish regularly films and videos about community life. And Queer University is a video training project which helps to train ordinary people to pick up camera and to make their own films. So Wei Tingting's film Shuang Bai China is one of such productions. And in recent years, so Chinese queer male filmmakers are working with African queer filmmakers and have this Queer University Africa, which is to train queer filmmakers from Africa to pick up cameras and so on. So these are all grassroots projects, not mediated by any nation states or transnational bodies, but they really showcases different ways of imagining a queer world. So people from a non-Western context started to talk to each other and work with each other and explore different types of queer possibilities. So a recent project, Imagining Queer Bandung, was initiated by Fan Popo, the queer filmmaker that I mentioned earlier, together with other Asian and African queer filmmakers to talk to each other, to see each other's films and to make films together. So they conjure up the kind of history an image of Queer Bandung, the Bandung Conference, to showcase a possibility of decolonization of the queer world. So there are also queer films or queer shorts made by ordinary filmmakers who participated in Queer University, such as 兄弟 Brother is a trans-themed film, and Papa Wei Feng is made by a dad in the P-Flag project, and 小月同志 is about working class queer, and this Nuar or magic is also about trans lives. So in a way, the Queer University have really inspired a lot of ordinary queer people who would otherwise not have had the opportunity to make films, to portray their lives and to showcase the different experiences that they are familiar with. So I'm aware of time, so I'm going to actually finish this part and then stop my talk. So of course, we have seen some queer community productions And a lot of those queer community productions are low budget, made underground or independently, and there's no chance for them to, for example, to go to mainstream cinema and to go to international film festivals, etc. So there are some queer indie films that were sent to international film festivals that won some awards, and Lo Ye's film, Spring Fever, is such a film. So it is not considered, it was not made for the queer audience. However, it has a very strong queer character, and the queer intimacy becomes a central theme for the film. So that's Spring Fever. 春风沉醉的夜晚。
是4点半的事，10点过来看。行。
过来了，你在这等我吧，过来接。还需要我继续跟带他们？我觉得还是见一下吧。我想好怎么跟他说了，咱们就说咱们是大学同学。
你没发现吗？我进来的时候看着我的眼神，他都认识我这种人。
这是他叫人跟踪我啊你！别走啊！最近看到今天那事儿。请问源自夜里面吗？什么好说？你知道发生什么事情吗？我告诉你家长，我跟别人打我们生活。在外面找个女的都可以，你凭什么找个男的？你还找我人来我不管。走。
Okay, so the topic of 同妻 or 同夫 and 同夫, so which is wife of a gay man or husband of a gay woman and so on, started to surface in this film. And in a way, actually, it become a recurring theme for many other films, because a lot of queer people in mainland China still have to get married heterosexually. So what about the lives of the other person who got into the marriage willingly, unwillingly, knowingly, or unknowingly? So before I talk about a recent film about queer family, let's also mention there is a film that managed to enter the mainstream cinema that managed to acquire the Longbiao, in a way, the kind of dragon seal, which is a kind of approval to make, which is a Sino-French co-production, which is called 寻找罗麦 or Looking for Roma or Seeking McCartney. So basically, that film is not a kind of is not an explicit queer film. It does showcase the relationship of two people, but what is a relationship although these two people, nobody knows. And even queer audience who watch this film, well, refuse to identify this as a queer film. Okay, so that's Looking for Roma or 寻找罗麦. Okay, so the last film that I'm going to talk about today before I stop, so which is the 2019 Teddy Award, Jury Award winner, A Dog Barking at the Moon, 再见南屏晚钟, directed by Xiang Zi. And this film, I mean, as usual, as with other films such as Spring Fever, deals with the issue of family. What if a gay man is still in a heterosexual marriage? What kind of emotional entanglement does it involve? And what is its impact on children and many other people?
现在你也结婚了，我也就不满意了。你把那方面早就不行了。
好了，这事待会再说，先吃饭。
刘姨当年就劝我别结，我没治她。一个女人还征服结婚了，大家会说你有毛病。
你不必跟他较真。前段时间他非说我和冯曦是同性恋。
你爸呀，这就是病，不用怪他，要怪就怪你奶奶把他生成这样。咱们好不容易聊会儿天，能不能别老说这些？去年不是一直说要离婚吗？后来怎么又没动静？你知道吗？你进来的爸爸是个同性恋。你吃的这些动物啊，那上辈子可都是你的家亲眷属，却还吃得下。My mom is vegetarian now. She said partner need to be a vegetarian too. 这我说啥？很长一段时间了，我都非常苦闷，直到回我老师的法，我才得以解脱。
It sounds like promise.
宣传孝道，宣传正法，拥护国家政策，反对邪淫，能治邪淫，能治你爸的问题，放在我这儿就不是邪教。想起来了，女儿为什么要找个外国人呢？
Okay, so that was a dog barking at the moon, although it doesn't sound like the translation of 再见南屏晚钟. Okay, so I think I'll finish my talk today and I'll stop the screen share now and then hand over the mic to the hosts. So let me still fight with the technology a bit. So stop share. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for Professor Bao. So to all the participants, particularly those latecomers of the whole event, this is Jacqueline Lin, a new research assistant professor at the Center for China Studies. Today we have Professor Bao to provide such a fruitful tour of the historical development of Chinese queer cinema. So thank you again for your wonderful presentation. So this talk today is co-hosted by gender studies as well. So thank you very much for Candice for her hosting, as well as gender studies to organize this wonderful event. So if you would like to have questions to Professor Bao, please type your questions in the chat box or feel free to raise your hands. So before you ask the questions, please turn on your camera and then introduce who you are and then go into the questions. So to give you a little bit time to consolidate your questions, we will have a commentary section. Today we will have our MPhil students, Miao Zixing. Her studies is on the masculinity construction on Chinese films in mainland China and Hong Kong. So first of all, she will give a brief commentary of the talk as well as Professor Bao's book, and then we will open the floor to the Q&A section. Zixing, please.
Okay. Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Professor Bao. Thank you for your wonderful sharing. In today's lecture, I really like you map out the root of Chinese queer cinema, from the earlier cinema to today's cinema. And it's apart from those very popular commercial films, you also introduce those not so popular independent films and documentary to us. I think it's very helpful, not only for film studies students, but also for those queer studies students. So thank you very much. And I just read your new published book, Queer Media in China. And I really like your book. And I feel they are two very, two aspects really inspire me a lot. Well, the first one is I really like you place Chinese queer cinema in a broader context, but not just in Chinese context, but in a more transnational context. And it's beyond the previous national cinema paradigm. So it's really inspired me a lot. And the second point I think very inspired me is you also did media archaeology in your book, because my own study is also want to inquire different cultural forms of martial arts culture. So when I read, you also talk about those other different cultural forms of queer media, like magazines or hotline or newsletters. I think that's are very, very interesting and really helpful for my own studies. Yes. And last, I want to ask a question. Because we all know that LGBT issues have started to emerge in China's mainstream media and public discourse since the 1990s. But I'm actually wondering that whether there were some still some related discussions or queer cultures in the previous era, like Mao era, or the very beginning of post-Mao era, because we cannot see so much research on that. Maybe they are not, but if they are not, do you think that period should be regarded as a kind of dead zone or blank? Or do you think there's still some relationship with today's Chinese queer culture? That's my question. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Zixin, for your very kind comment and critique. So I think that the question is very good. So that potentially points to one, in a way, research gap in Chinese queer historiography, which is the kind of, so we know a lot of queer histories in pre-modern China and in Republican era. So Howard Chang and other people's work are very significant. That also include Kang Wenqing's work, are also very significant in helping us understand the kind of representation of homoeroticism or even different genders and sexualities in the Republican era. And then recent works by Kang Wenqing is also very illuminating, because he's conducting a queer oral history project into older gay people, for example, now 60-year-old or 80 years old and so on. So they, in a way, recall the history of the kind of their experiences in the socialist era and in the post-socialist era. Of course, a lot of common understandings are true. For example, so a lot of gays and lesbians were prosecuted actually in those eras, from the kind of Mao era to early post-Mao era and so on and so forth. And there was a crime or penalty called hooliganism, 流氓罪, that was used to prosecute many gays and lesbians. But what's also interesting to Professor Kang's finding is that there are also actually a lot of different pictures. For example, in the Mao era, I mean, in the armies and in schools and in the countryside, there seems to be a kind of uninhabited expression of sexuality, because nobody knows what sexuality is, nobody knows what gay or lesbian is, and so on. So there was very strong sense of homoeroticism or homosociality during those era. So which is a kind of alternative narrative. So along with those repressive hypotheses. But on the other hand, he discovered that it was actually in the 1980s, in particular, with the start of the Yanda, which is kind of the kind of stopping the bourgeois liberalism, so 反对资产阶级自由化, that a lot of people started to be prosecuted. And also during that era, so the police have a lot of remits in a way, they have to finish their targets. So amongst all the targets, it seems that gays and lesbians are easy targets because they meet very regularly in parks. It's easier actually for the policemen to finish their target. So in other words, a lot of people imagining 1980s to be the kind of the surface of queer identities and desires, which was true, but which was also an era where gays and lesbians attracted unprecedented attention, that they were even prosecuted more than in historical times. So what I want to say is that this research still needs to be done, and there are some oral history projects, including those conducted by Ashan from Guangzhou, and those narratives are likely to give us as many insights as well as contradictions. They just showcase how complex the history is and how difficult it is to understand history, as well as to recognize the multiple narratives coexisting in a historical period. Jacqueline, you're muted.
You muted yourself.
Oh, sorry. We have a queue of questions here. So first of all, we'll have Sam and then Joe. And lastly, I will read Kenneth Wong's questions. Sam, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bao. I'm Sam Chen from the School of Journalism and Communication, also at CHK. I'm an assistant professor here. So recently I written a book on dating apps in China, and and your work has been very influential for me because I use your work as a lot of background information about queer representation. I guess my question is more about, I have a confusion here. Because earlier you mentioned that in the 80s, 90s, there are queer film that doesn't explicitly mention or portray homoeroticism. But queer people actually identify those films. But then you also mentioned that recently, the Looking for Roma, that film was positioned kind of as a queer film, but then queer people actually do not identify those films as queer. So my question here is, so it seems that even the film itself become a site for a kind of negotiation of meanings here. And how will this lack of consistency, if you will, or lack of consistency impact on using film as an activism tool in contemporary China?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you, Sam. By the way, I'm a fan of your works. The politics of dating app in China has been very inspirational. So thanks very much for your question. I think your question is very important in that it points to the importance of the audience in producing queer text. So queer text is not only produced by queer, for example, identified authors or about queer stories, but it is also generated by the audience reception. So in a way, actually, my statement of queer people not identifying with queer looking for Roma is probably a simplistic statement. I'll just pointing to the fact there are many negative comments about looking for Roma. So probably some people do identify with that film and do like the film. So I'm not ruling out that possibility. But I think the key issue here is that we are talking for looking for Roma, we're talking about 2016 or 18, when there are enough queer productions in China at the moment. There are dating apps and there are foreign queer films and dubbed or fan subbed in Chinese. So people have more access to queer representations. So therefore, urban audience tend to be more, in a way, choosy or picky in judging what is a queer text or not. Whereas in the 1980s and 90s, when there were not an abundance of queer representations, so whenever you see two men actually holding hands on screen, whether they are explicit or implicit, a lot of queer people would feel that it was a big statement of their existence. And of course, we can't just, compare those two historical periods to say that which representation is queerer, which representation is not. I think the most important thing is that queerness also exists in the audience reception, in the kind of negotiation of meaning, as you have nicely put it. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam, for your questions. So next, we will have Joe, please.
Hi, Dr. Bao. Thank you very, very much. I'm a great fan of your work in general, and thank you so much for your talk today. To introduce myself, I'm reading Chinese at the moment at Cambridge and currently researching queer culture in China, actually alongside Jacqueline. I have a question that actually resonates with what you just mentioned about queer fan subbing practices, which is, to what extent are PRC people, both queer and non-queer, able to participate in the diverse queer cinema cultures of other countries, for example, watching Thai BL films? And if they do, is it known how PRC people access and consume these media? Thanks.
Great. So thank you, Joe. Okay, so in fact, I'm not in the best position to answer this question, but I can refer you to two scholars, or probably three scholars, Jamie Jing Zhao, who is also here today, who would be able to tell you more about the kind of queer popular culture in contemporary China, which includes transnational queer popular culture. So there is, of course, official and unofficial, underground, all kind of above ground circulations of queer transnational text. So including those from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on. So that's one source that you can check out. And another source is Guo Ting Guo and Jonathan Evans. Ting Guo was from University Essex, and Jonathan Evans is from University of Glasgow. They have currently a project called, anyway, I forgot the project title. Is Translating Queerness. Is essentially about fan subbing, 字幕组, for example, so 计划字幕组, 同志一番人, and how they actually translated the text and subtitled the text, what is the politics of translations, and so on. So the title of their project is Translation for Change. As you can imagine, this would be their argument. Translation is part of the social activism. But I earlier this year attended a conference organized by them. So apart from saying great things about fan subbing and the transnational circulation of queer content, and I also want to say one thing, which is the kind of potential marginalization of queer independent production in China. So today, if you ask a lot of queer people in mainland China, they probably have seen more of kind of Hollywood queer films or European queer films than Chinese independent queer films. Of course, the kind of marginalization resulted from many reasons, including China's existing censorship. But there's also the kind of, in a way, the kind of homogenization of queer aesthetics and queer content. So when we talk about the kind of cultural hegemony of queerness in a kind of global context, I think this discussion actually is still relevant, and we still need to ask what those kind of transnational queer culture do in China, and what have they potentially marginalized in China.
Thank you very much. So we have Kenneth. He is in the library. So Kenneth, do you want to ask your question directly?
Right. Yeah, just excuse me for not able to turn on the camera. So Professor Bao, with the recent cease operation of LGBTQ NGOs in China, what are these past queer film narrative can lead us to? So if the on-ground mobilization of the activism field, will this online or cinematic queer film help in shifting the activism? Or do we draw back to the comfort of queer aesthetics, as you mentioned, the queer art as a failure? That's my first question. Second question is more general because I didn't dive in deeper in the queer film development in China. Since you come through the timeline and the history, would you say if we put in the context of East Asian queer film studies, what are the distinguished difference of the China's queer films compared to the other countries in the East Asia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth, for your questions. I'll answer them briefly because a lot of things do not have answers. So in fact, when I accepted the invitation, I was asking myself actually whether it's the right time to talk about queer cinema or, in a way, queer activism in China today, when queer activism obviously has suffered many defeats in recent years and especially in recent months and so on. But I still feel that it is still important to talk about them. So to talk about them at least is to remind people of their existence, this important history and heritage, and the tenacity and resistance of the community. So in a way, we still can draw on the inspiration, draw the inspiration from them. So if you just think about Beijing Queer Film Festival, so Beijing Queer Film Festival was shut down actually in 2005 and had to shift locations overnight. And in the next few years, so it also suffered many frustrations. At that time, everybody thought that was the end. So Beijing Film Festival would stop, but now it's still continuing. And 2 years ago, when Shanghai Pride was shut down, and many people think that's the end, but it hasn't ended, and many other people still haven't given up. I think that it's this kind of keeping the hope going is important, and visiting that history actually at least reminds us that there are actually those brave people, there are all those excellent works that has been, in a way, going on all the time, that we cannot simply say let's give up now and that's the end. At least that's the information message that I tell to myself. So the next question is queer art failure and queer art failure. Yes, in a way, actually, we can actually look at this positively. So at least we learned something and understand how difficult it is. But I also don't want to valorize the queer art failure, because some people, especially kind of, I don't know, in the or white Western middle class, can afford to fail, but other people cannot. So it really depends on what we learn from this, but keeping the optimism going is what I learned from queer art failure. So that's the answer to your first question. The answer to your second question is that it's essentially about what's the difference between mainland Chinese films and East Asian queer films. I wouldn't say that there's much difference, because in a way, Chinese queer cinema is part of the East Asian queer film cinema circuit, and the audience from mainland China actually also watches film from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And there's extensive cultural exchange in the region. So their aesthetics and politics and representations actually may influence each other. In fact, there are some shared themes such as family and pro forma marriage or cooperative marriage, among others. So there are indeed many similarities, but it does seem that a lot of mainland Chinese films have an engagement with with the political, with the politics. So whether it's from Donggong, Xigong, East Palace, West Palace, without direct engagement with the police, or the exploration of the power between police and the gay people. And with a more recent thing, well, I finished my talk with 再见南屏晚钟, so a dog barking at the moon, in which there is police presence, there's also the portrayal of a cult and so on, which further problematizes actually the role of the state and of course the role of social norms to shape queer lives and desires and so on. So it does seem that there is a very strong political engagement and in a way entanglement in those queer representations. Of course, when I say this, I'm also aware there are exceptions. So this is a really terrible overgeneralization. There might be more important or prominent features which requires further study. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. Due to the time limit, we will only have time for the last questions. So if you would like to ask your questions, feel free to raise your hand. You'll type your questions in the chat box. So if not in the moment, I will take the advantage as a host to ask a question. I'm more curious about the production and institution of the filmmaking within the industry. From the history you just introduced, it seems that the production is kind of begin from those art filmmaker who can get funding from either the foreign investments or different sources. And then if they get chance to do the independent documentary films, sometimes they can have crowdsourcing through online. Nowadays, we observe that. So from the institutional perspective or the production perspective, what do you see like in the future? So is it the digital platforms or digital turn in China now provide more social spaces for those filmmakers to have more voices, or is still like we need to going back to the pre-digital turn that we need to still use multiple sources from different areas to maximize the possibility to have those really wonderful films for the queer community? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Jacqueline. This is a really great question. So this question actually can be divided into two sections. The first section is previous productions. Well, we are primarily talking about the kind of queer genre and queer aesthetics. So what do they portray and so on. And in fact, the subject matter and the aesthetics of the representations have a lot to do with the ways of production, exhibitions, and circulation. For example, you have identified the kind of indie film production mode, which is most sixth generation filmmakers use. Actually, they get private funding and then get the film funded and sent to international film festivals. So that was probably the mode of Donggong, Xigong, and 今年夏天 and so on and so forth. So, and also there are community crowdfunding, and even without funding, for example, the director simply relies on friends and other people's goodwill. So this is demonstrated by Fan Popo and Cui Zi'en's films. So a lot of their community films were made very low budget and rely on the kind of goodwill and hospitality of other people in the community. And also there are also commercial productions such as Looking for Roma. It is a kind of Sino-French joint production. Of course, it was meant to be a commercial film, so it has the ambition actually to go into mainstream cinema. But at the same time, we also see, for example, the independent production by Xiang Zi, who primarily actually made the film by herself or for herself with a very small team and with a limited budget and so on. So there are all those different modes. When we see actually what those queer representations, whether they are more transgressive characters or they are homonormative characters, like homonormative characters. I'm thinking about Lan Yu in mind. So this has a lot with their budget in mind and their market or kind of target audience in mind. So yes, production mode is an important way to think about queer films. And the second question is, what is the future now? And now we probably see online productions a lot, whether they are 网络微电影 or 网络大电影, so microfilms or longer features, or even actually television dramas on those online channels and so on. Of course, I mean, that is very much affected by the government policy. So whenever there is a kind of censorship, boys love stories and so on, these productions will be affected. So that's one production mode, which is commercial companies, especially new media companies, invest on those boys love dramas. They invest on boys love dramas for good reasons, because they're not explicitly gay, but they have a gay audience, but they have a queer audience and a younger audience. So those films actually all have a boys love or girls love sentiment or themes, etc. is in a way actually decided by commercial and promotional strategies. But on the other hand, we see young queer people themselves simply making a film on their own phones or through their digital camera, which doesn't cost a lot. And then they upload it on kind of YouTube or Tencent or whatever streaming platforms in China. They mostly take a kind of individual and also autoethnographic mode, so talking about their experience, and some of them actually have a good production quality, and others are probably just like any of the other 手机 mobile phone films that you take. So in other words, now we see actually queer films mostly online, and but there are two modes. One mode is made by big companies in order to attract audience and make money. And the other mode is overall made by individuals for themselves, for their friends and for the communities. So we really also need to study them separately.
Thank you very much. So we are running out a little bit of time. So at the end, I would like to invite all the audience to present a big thank you to you, Professor Bao, and then have a big clap to you, or to give a thumbs up on your on the screen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and others. Thank the CUHK's China Study Center, as well as the Gender Studies Program, for hosting today's talk.
Thank you.
And thank all the audience for your participation and questions.
Thanks. So we will have the record, and then Candice will send you later with the link for you to catch up. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone, and have a nice afternoon, morning, or evening.
Have a nice day. It's a really tiring morning for you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's okay. It's not too early.
See you.
Bye everyone. Thank you. 辛苦了。
辛苦。